our sponsors, Southern New Hampshire University, CCA Global, Union of Concerned Scientists, New Hampshire College and University Council, and Jeanne Shaheen Sen. I also want to thank our patrons whose names are listed in the program. The Council is a membership organization which depends on its members for their support. So I will ask all of you who are members to please raise your hands. Thank you. Those of you who are embarrassed because you cannot raise your hand can relieve that anxiety by becoming members as you leave this evening. I also would like to have the members of our board who are here to stand and be recognized. Tonight we'll be presenting our 2018 Global Leadership Award. And to present the award is Dr. Patty Lynott, President of University College at Southern New Hampshire University and a former board member of the Council.
So, good evening, everyone. It's so good to see everyone. I haven't seen a lot of you folks in a while. So, it is a particular privilege for me to introduce this year's recipient of the Global Leadership Award presented by the World Affairs Council of New Hampshire. The award is extended to a person or organization that has shown leadership in promoting international knowledge and understanding in New Hampshire and has expanded New Hampshire's connections with the world. So this year, I am very proud to announce that the Global Leadership Award will be presented to Paul LeBlanc, the president of Southern New Hampshire University, for the last 15 years. So I have worked for Paul for 12 years, and there are days it feels like 20, and there are days it feels like yesterday. I mean, it goes so quickly. In these years that I've worked for Paul, he has not simply dramatically transformed a small college in the city of Manchester. Paul has directly and significantly blown away the guardrails that restrict learning to this very conventional, traditional, exclusive, narrow experience. He's really changed the face of learning in this country. Paul has been nationally recognized for his visionary leadership. He has been recognized for his curricular acumen. He has been recognized for embracing technology and innovation in a way that is genuinely transforming American higher ed. But what's really special about this particular award is that it recognizes Paul's impact on expanding New Hampshire's connections to the world. Southern New Hampshire University and New Hampshire College have long-established histories of recruiting international students to our campus here in Manchester. And at one time, we were actually the most internationally diverse college in northern New England outside of Dartmouth. On campus at our peak, we had something like 750 students from over 60 countries studying with us. Now, since Paul's arrival, we have had partnership programs and/or some type of international initiative in Dubai, in Malaysia, in Vietnam, in South Korea, the Philippines, housing the World Affairs Council on this campus, adjacent here. That's because of Paul's desire to provide our university community with opportunities to stay connected to the important international issues and challenges of the day. About 8 or 9 years ago, Paul mandated that we significantly increase our study abroad opportunities for all new students. And I want to point something out to you. Study abroad is not a moneymaker for colleges. We get tuition, but we lose housing revenue. Didn't matter to Paul. He said this is something we need to do. And Paul and Pat Finland, they personally fund a very generous scholarship program for domestic students who want to travel abroad. They did not want cost to be an impediment to any kid that wanted that study abroad experience. They have opened their home on more times than I can count to kids from Syria, from Romania, from Great Britain, from Kyrgyzstan, and I'm not talking weekends. I mean, they've literally, these kids have been able to stay there until they get their feet in the ground and get acclimated. But The two formal institutional initiatives that really demonstrate Paul's vision and his leadership in terms of international knowledge and understanding are the SNU Center for New Americans at YWCA in New Hampshire, and the SNU Global Education Movement, our GEM program. So our investment in and commitment to the SNU Center for New Americans at the YWCA is designed to help immigrants, refugees in the state have better access to the support systems and services they need to live successful lives. The programming at the center includes things like college preparation and counseling, to include financial literacy, English for speakers of other languages, those classes, cultural orientation, so these new Americans can get cultural competency and understand the laws and the customs of the US, and then college level courses. The GEM program, the SNU Global Education Movement, is so awesome and so humbling because of the many conflicts around the world, and we're all aware of them. The number of refugees seeking asylum is just exploding. Paul and Pat actually visited a refugee camp a couple years ago. I remember getting an email from Paul. It was like 9 o'clock at night. I'm thinking, what is he doing? It's got to be like 2 in the morning over there, right? And it was raw. What he was seeing, the horror of the hopelessness. And I remember thinking to myself, oh yeah, something's going to happen here. And sure enough, it was shortly after that we took in earnest this issue of providing access to college education for refugees. So when refugees do try to build a new life in a new country, there's a different language, different industries, different educational organizations. So trying to find a job to take care of their families is really tough. So working with our partners around on the ground around the world, we are delivering incredibly inexpensive, incredibly accessible, competency-based College for America program at the Kiziba refugee camp in Rwanda to help these refugees find work. And because we're enjoying early success in that program, we are soon going to be expanding into refugee camps in Malawi, Kenya, Lebanon, and South America. I'd like to read a little letter, and this letter is from Senator Maggie Hassan. Dear friends, I regret that I cannot be there this evening for the World Affairs Council of New Hampshire 2018 forum, but I join you in celebrating your important work. The World Affairs Council seeks to mobilize as many citizens as possible in a quest for greater knowledge of international affairs and understanding of global politics. By having members actively meet international guests and foreign citizens, the Council has fostered citizen diplomacy and intercultural dialogue, building on New Hampshire's rich tradition of civic engagement. Congratulations to Paul LeBlanc, President of Southern New Hampshire University, on receiving the well-deserved honor of the 2018 Global Leadership Award. Paul, your leadership of SNU's global education, outreach, and service programs sets a strong example for the higher education community and strengthens our state and communities across the globe. Thank you again to the World Affairs Council for your efforts to help our citizens better understand the world around us, and to everyone who helped organize tonight's event. I look forward to continuing to work with you to help make the Granite State and our entire country a more welcoming and inclusive place. With very good wishes, Margaret Hassan. So, let me say this. Of all the really cool, if not life-altering opportunities that our university now offers because of the leadership of Paul LeBlanc, great vision, because of his genuine sense of obligation to humankind, and because of his desire to connect our university community to the larger world, it is my privilege and my pleasure to award the World Affairs Council of New Hampshire Global Leadership Award to my boss, Paul LeBlanc.
much to Patty. It was very kind of you, thank you. I was thinking about, you may have noticed we live in a bit of a time of discord, unless you've been looking for a rock somewhere. And you may have noticed that if you have a television, that we sometimes have advertisements wrestling at you. And a line that we've used in the most recent one has been that talent is universally distributed, but opportunity is not. And the work we get to do with international students reminds me of this again and again and again. No more so than in the refugee camps that Patty mentioned. So we've met extraordinary talent, extraordinary students in those cases. And feeling pretty glum about the Kennedy announcement on the Supreme Court, thinking about the years of challenge we have ahead of us, and driving over here tonight, Pat and I were talking, and I was reminded that it's actually in times of great discord that societies rise above and do amazing things. It's often, you've heard this quip that 900 years of peace in Switzerland produced the cuckoo clock. But the same 900 years of civil war and discord and strife in England produced Shakespeare, right? Think about the art that it produced, think about the literature it produced. And if you think about what's happening in America today, as bad as it is, we're seeing probably one of the great times in American culture in terms of our music, our art, our literature. It's in times of strife that people rise up, and it's a time that we're called upon as educators to rise up. Greatness doesn't happen in placid moments. Greatness happens in moments of challenge. There's a call upon the World Affairs Council at a time of nativism and a kind of inward looking and closing our borders that we're called to step up. And I prefer to see this time not as one to sort of be downtrodden, but one in which we collectively rise up and do the work that's being asked of us by the globe. So thank you. It's that spirit that I accept this award. Thank you so much.
I'd like to add my congratulations to Paul, and on behalf of the council to say how proud and grateful we are to be part of the Southern Hampshire University community. Please turn off your cell phone. Our speaker this evening is Trita Parsi. Mr. Parsi was born in Iran at the age of 4, left with his family to Sweden to escape political repression. He holds undergraduate and graduate degrees from Uppsala University, Stockholm University in Sweden, and a PhD from Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies. He was the founder and the president of the National Iranian American Council, which supports dialogue and engagement between the United States and Iran, which he believes will help stabilize the Middle East and bolster moderates in Iran. He's written several books about American, Israeli, and Iranian relations. His latest book, Losing an Enemy, Obama, Iran, and the Triumph of Diplomacy, was described by Ambassador Thomas Pickering, one of our recent speakers, as the best book written about the negotiation of the Iran nuclear agreement. As you know from the recent decision to take the United States out of that agreement and the actions of the United States to enforce sanctions against Iran, this is a dynamic situation with potentially important outcomes for the United States, Iran, agreement signatories, and the region. So it's my pleasure to introduce Mr. Parsi.
Thank you so much. Should I turn it down or? All good? It's working? I'm going to take this away. All right. Thank you so much. It's a great pleasure being here. I'm really grateful to the Council for the invitation, for all of you being here tonight. I was very inspired with what you said, President LeBlanc, because my talk is actually extremely depressing. So I'm hoping that everyone will really internalize the spirit that he presented, because that's probably the best way of making sure that my description of what is taking place right now and what has taken place in the situation between the United States and Iran will not depress you, but rather mobilize you to rise up. I also want to give a big thank you to all of the World Affairs Councils. I am very grateful and very fortunate. I think this is the 40th or the 50th that I have had the pleasure and honor of addressing in the last year or so that I've been on a book tour promoting the book. And it definitely gives me a lot of hope to see that there are these organizations and individuals that are truly interested in what is taking place in the world, recognize the importance for the United States and for the world to have more diplomacy, more understanding, and get into these issues a little bit deeper rather than just having a superficial understanding of these things. So I want to really thank all of you and hope that you will continue to do this, because it is going to be more important in the future. As was mentioned, this is my third book, and I was hoping that it would be a very different type of a book compared to my previous books. My two previous books documented the many missed opportunities for diplomacy between the United States and Iran, and every time those opportunities were missed, we moved closer and closer towards a military confrontation. But for the third book, finally, we actually have what I would call a triumph of diplomacy. Certainly not something that created peace between the United States and Iran, but rather created an opportunity to lose Iran as an enemy. An opportunity, not a final outcome. Unfortunately, right as I was finishing the last chapter of the book, a certain TV reality star won the presidency, and I ended up having to rewrite the last chapter, and it once again became very similar to the previous books. Nevertheless, in the spirit of President LeBlanc, let's be optimistic. If we understand how we actually managed to get this deal, and remember, no one thought it would be possible to resolve the US-Iranian conflict through diplomacy. No one thought that this actually was going to work, and yet it did. So what went right? And if we understand what went right, perhaps we still have the opportunity of resurrecting the chance of being able to lose Iran as an enemy. Now, throughout these negotiations, I found myself in a rather unique position. I was an advisor to the Obama administration during the talks, and I also had access to the Iranian side because of my previous books. I had interviewed Zarif, the Iranian foreign minister, numerous times, and had great access to him. And it enabled me to really observe both sides very, very closely and be able to see their calculations, their fears, their domestic political restraints, and all of these different things that come into the mix that oftentimes you won't see on TV, but that is very, very much a big part of the psychology of the negotiations. And I thought it would be a great thing to do, to document how and tell the story of how an international crisis that truly was on the verge of a major military confrontation actually was resolved peacefully through diplomacy, without a single shot being fired and without a single angry 6 a.m. tweet being sent off. I think it's a story that will perhaps give us the type of inspiration to be able to make sure that our situation today with North Korea can be resolved diplomatically, and that perhaps the situation with Iran and future adversaries also can be resolved without a single shot being fired. I think one of the first things we have to recognize when we talk about the Iran nuclear deal, and I want to go back in history and really explain how we got to this point before we talk about how we go forward, is to recognize that this was not just about the nuclear issue. This was about the geopolitical balance of power in the region, something that is continuing. And to do that, I need to first take you back to April 2012. At a moment when the United States was imposing crippling sanctions on the Iranians. The Iranians were aggressively going forward with their nuclear program. The Israelis were making regular threats of taking preemptive military action. At this moment, the most unusual group of people gathered in a very small country in Europe, far away from the eyes of the media. This group included several Iranian officials, including 2 members of the nuclear negotiation team. Several American officials, including a very senior American general. But perhaps most surprisingly, 5 senior Israelis were at this meeting as well. And what was most surprising was actually what was said. Let me give you a quote. This is not about enrichment. This was never about enrichment. The Israeli official looked straight into the eyes of the Iranians across the room as he uttered these words, leaving all of us quite surprised. Because for 2 decades we had heard that Iran's nuclear program, particularly its enrichment of uranium, constituted an existential threat to Israel. Yet here, the Israelis themselves were telling it directly to the Iranians. This wasn't about enrichment. Instead, he went on to explain that Israel was looking for what he said, a sweeping attitude change on behalf of Iran. Israel could not accept that the United States would come to terms with Iran without Iran coming to terms with Israel, particularly questioning Israel's right to exist in many of its policies. If that were to happen, the Israelis feared, Israel would be abandoned. The United States would resolve the core element of its tensions with Iran, and then it would move on, because it had global responsibilities. Israel, however, would still be in the region and still face a hostile Iran, but now without the full backing of the United States. This was their fear. And as a result, they said, Israel would do everything it could in its power to prevent a nuclear deal from being struck, precisely because of the fear of a battle. Not only was this a moment of honesty, it was also a moment of utmost clarity that really revealed what the true motivations and driving forces behind this conflict was. It is certainly not the talking points you would hear on MSNBC or Fox News. But behind closed doors, when they were talking to each other directly, this was what was being said. To better understand the Israeli position, I need to take you back a couple of more decades in history, 1991 to 1992. This is the moment where two major geopolitical shocks take place globally and regionally. On a global level, the Soviet Union collapses, and the United States ends up becoming the sole superpower who move towards the unipolar system. On a global and regional level, the United States and a UN coalition defeat Saddam Hussein in the First Persian Gulf War and dramatically changes the balance of power in the region. With that balance gone, the question was, what will it be replaced by? And whenever you have these type of disruptions to the equilibrium of the system, it tends to drive powerful countries into a deep rivalry in order to ensure that whatever follows, whatever the new balance is, it will be to their benefit and not to the benefit of their rivals. Now, for the first time actually, the Iranians and the Israelis started to look at each other as rivals, because the new constellation of power in the region was such that Iran and Israel emerged as two of the most powerful states in the Middle East. Prior to this, and this is a parenthesis but an important one, prior to this, the Israelis and the Iranians actually had very close security collaboration that started during the time of the Shah for a very simple reason. Both of these states shared common threats and enemies. Soviet Union was one, and strong Arab nationalist powers such as Saddam under Iraq under Saddam, or Egypt under Nasser was the other. And this had driven them together to a very close security collaboration that actually survived the Islamic Revolution in 1979. It continued, but more hidden. And I'm sure everyone here, most of you would remember the Iran-Contra Scandal, which was an Israeli effort to bring the United States and Iran closer together in the midst of Ayatollah Khomeini's reign. Because back then, the Israelis were the ones lobbying on behalf of Iran in Washington, telling Washington to talk to Iran, to sell arms to Iran, and not pay attention to Iranian rhetoric because it wasn't reflective to actual policy. All of this changes in 1992 because the Soviet Union is gone, Iran is gone, the threats are gone, and instead now they started viewing each other as rivals. The question was, what would the new balance of power be? And the Israelis moved first very cleverly, arguing that a new balance needed to be created, and for the Israelis to accept the risk-taking of making peace with the Palestinians, which was what both the Bush senior administration was pushing the Israelis to do, as well as Clinton as he came in. The United States needed to isolate and contain Iran because Iran was now the new threat. This was highly problematic for the Iranians, but the United States accepted this notion and established and ordered a policy that was called dual containment. The new order in the region would be based on American hegemony and the isolation of Iran and Iraq at the same time. This had never done before. For the Israelis, for the Egyptians, for the Saudis, this was great news. The United States is essentially guaranteeing their security and maximizing their maneuverability in the region. For the Iranians, this was a major letdown. They had hoped that after the Persian Gulf War, because they had quietly worked together with the US against Saddam, they would be allowed to come in from the cold and escape the isolation that they had brought on themselves because of their radicalism. Instead, the United States doubles down on Iran's isolation, and the Iranian response is to try to do everything they could to bring down the dual containment policy. And their calculation was that the weakest link in the American strategy was the peace process between the Israelis and the Palestinians. If that peace process could be collapsed, could be sabotaged, none of the other strategic objectives of the United States could be achieved. So they started heavily targeting the peace process, supporting groups using terror and violence against the Israelis. But for everything they did to bring down dual containment, it was actually not the Iranians that collapsed dual containment. It was the United States itself. More specifically, George W. Bush. Because by going into Iraq in 2003, they automatically discarded the idea of containing Iraq. Now instead we were pursuing regime change in hope that we would create a new constellation in the region that would be much more pliant to our dominance of the region. But precisely because the Iraq war ended up being such a failure, the United States no longer actually could replace the previous order with a new one. Instead, we ended up having a Middle East that was orderless. And particularly since 2005, there has been no hegemon capable of imposing an equilibrium on the Middle East. No constellation or combination of powers that have had that power. We are essentially still in that journey from one balance to the next. We don't know exactly where in that journey we are, but we're still going through that journey. And it's precisely why there is so much instability in the Middle East right now, and why the rivalries between Iran, Saudi Arabia, Israel, etc. is so intense, because they're trying to establish the new equilibrium, the new rules of the game. For the Israelis and the Saudis, the invasion of Iraq ended up becoming a disaster. Previous order that was very beneficial to them collapsed. And now, because the United States had taken out the Taliban to the east of Iran, Saddam to the west of Iran, Iran was now unchained. It could expand its influence, it could expand its power, and the United States was increasingly lacking the capacity of holding Iran back. But for the Iranians, despite the fact that they benefited from this, they still lacked one very critical component, which was they could not lock in this new favorable constellation unless the United States was willing to negotiate with them and recognize Iran as a major power in the region. Their calculation was that by just having that recognition through those negotiations would be sufficient in order for them to be able to lock this in. And it's precisely because of this that the Israelis opposed these negotiations. But despite this, ironically, the Israelis and the Iranians actually used the same instrument to achieve opposite objectives, which was the nuclear program. For the Israelis, the nuclear program was, as I mentioned, defined as an existential threat. An existential threat that they combined with completely unrealistic demands, which made any type of a compromise completely impossible. And those unrealistic demands was that Iran would have no enrichment whatsoever. If you take an unrealistic demand that completely disables any compromise and you call it an existential threat, the calculation was that this would inevitably lead the United States being forced to take military action against Iran, and the balance of power that would emerge out of that war would obviously be more beneficial to Israel. The Iranian calculation was completely the opposite. Yes, aggressively going forward with a nuclear program would risk a war, but precisely because Iraq had been such a failure, precisely because the American public had such a war fatigue, the calculation was that if the Iranians advanced their position, they would essentially force the United States to come to terms that Iran would continue to have enrichment and come to the table with a more flexible position. And this was the crux of the dilemma for the United States. How do you prevent Iran from getting a nuclear weapons option without going to war, without allowing the Israelis to start a war that the US did not want to have, and without going to the negotiating table and enabling the Iranians to be in a position in which they would define the new balance of power in the region? The strategy that the Bush administration pursued to achieve this objective was to completely reject negotiations, adopt a zero enrichment policy, and pursue coercive measures ranging from sanctions, sabotage, cyber warfare, and all other types of pressure. The track record of that policy is quite clear. In 2003, the Iranians had roughly 150 centrifuges. Those are the machines you spin to enrich uranium to higher levels. By the time Bush left office, Iran had 8,000 centrifuges. Iran had zero stockpile of low-enriched uranium in 2003. By the time Bush left office, Iran had 1,500 kilos of LEU, enough for one single nuclear weapon. Clearly, a different approach was needed. And when Obama came in, he campaigned on the idea that we need to reinstate diplomacy at the center of American statecraft. And he would talk to all of America's adversaries, ranging from Iran to Cuba to Venezuela. But Iran became the poster child for his policy. But Senator Obama quickly realized once he became president that talking about diplomacy with Iran is much easier than conducting diplomacy with Iran. And after one attempt in 2009, which failed largely because of problems on the Iranian side, Obama quickly found himself equipped with only the same instruments that Bush had, which was cyber warfare, sanctions, pressure, and other forms of sabotage. With one big difference. Because Obama had pursued diplomacy, which Bush had not, and because he enjoyed a significant degree of international legitimacy, which again Bush did not, he could do what Bush couldn't, which was assemble a very strong, if not unprecedented, sanctions regime coalition against Iran, and try to pressure the Iranians, cripple their economy until they backed down, and essentially capitulated the issue of enrichment. The Obama administration even managed to convince the Europeans to end all their oil purchases from Iran. 40% of Iran's oil was being sold to Europe. It went down to zero. Sanctions were imposed on Iran's central bank. The week that happened, the Iranian currency dropped 30%. Riots broke out in Tehran. Overall, the administration estimates that the Iranian economy contracted roughly 25% over 3 years. Clearly, the Iranians had underestimated Obama. They never thought he would be able to put together such a strong sanctions regime. But Obama also underestimated the Iranians. Clearly, they were hurting, but they were not breaking. Nor were they without a response. In fact, their response was a complete mirror image of the American calculation, the American strategy. If the American strategy was, we are going to cripple the Iranian economy until they realize that it's not worthwhile, it does not make any sense for them to continue their nuclear program. Force them, push them into a situation in which they have to choose between having a nuclear program or having an economy. The Iranians had the exact same calculation. They're going to double down on the nuclear program and convince the United States that sanctions will only get you more centrifuges. So they started deliberately expanding the nuclear program as a response to the sanctions, and a race emerged. 2 or 3 clocks, actually, that were competing with each other. You had the American sanctions clock trying to cripple the Iranian economy and force them to capitulate. You had the Iranian nuclear clock, in which they were trying to present the United States with a nuclear fait accompli. And then you had the Israeli wild card of whether they would take military action or not. As these clocks were ticking, there was an ongoing diplomatic effort at the P5+1 level, which wasn't really going anywhere. It was, to a certain extent, mostly ensuring that there was some dialogue taking place. And it started to become clear to the president that the likelihood of getting the Iranians to back down in that forum was not particularly high. A senator from not too far from over here convinced the president that the Iranians would only compromise if he managed to create a direct channel to Iran's supreme leader. A secret channel far away from all of the other cameras. Only in that circumstance would the Iranians be able to give in. That senator was John Kerry, head of the Foreign Relations Committee. He had worked closely with the country of Oman in the Arabian Peninsula to win the release of 3 Americans that had wrongfully been jailed in Iran. I'm sure you all heard about the 3 American hikers. It's pretty sad because they hiked once and now they're forever known as the 3 American hikers. They're actually accomplished journalists, English teachers, etc. But that one hiking trip came to define them. And frankly, they were also not in Iran. They were hiking in Iraqi Kurdistan. an area where the border was not marked. They saw a couple of soldiers that waved them over. As they walked over to see what they wanted, unbeknownst to them, they entered Iranian territory. They were arrested and accused of spying. The Omanis, who have a strong relationship with Iran for historic reasons, stepped in, and after, I think, roughly 500 or so days, managed to win their release through the help of John Kerry as well. And the Iranis did this because they wanted to show the United States that they have the capacity, or almost a unique capacity, of maneuvering this very complex Iranian political landscape. And they also wanted to do this to convince the United States that the US should use their offices to resolve the nuclear crisis because they were terrified that this would lead to a military confrontation. So in July 2012, the first meeting is held outside of Muscat, the capital of Oman. 2 mid-level American officials are there, 2 from the Iranian side, and the meeting was essentially a disaster. The Americans went there for 2 reasons. We wanted to know if this truly was a channel that had the authorization of Iran's supreme leader. There was no value negotiating with people who had no authority to negotiate. Secondly, we wanted to see how close are the Iranians to capitulate. The Iranians came for a completely different reason. They wanted to see how close is the United States to capitulate as a result of the pressure they were imposing on the US by advancing their nuclear program. So as you can imagine, after one day of essentially talking past each other, it was a failure. Both sides went back home, quite disappointed, and the channel almost died. We had elections in the United States in November 2012, so most things were dormant, but by January 2013, a completely new sense of urgency dawned on the White House. Exactly a year earlier, then Secretary of Defense Leon Panetta had stated publicly that Iran's breakout capability is 12 months, meaning the time it would take for the Iranians from making a decision to build a bomb to having the ready material for a bomb, which is not the lower enriched uranium, you have to enrich it further above 90%. That would take 12 months. By January 2013, the estimation was that Iran's breakout capability had shrunk to 8 to 12 weeks. Clearly, the Iranian nuclear clock was ticking faster than the American sanctions clock. The president came to realize that unless something changed, if we just continued on this path, pretty soon the United States would only be faced with 2 options. Either accepting Iran as a de facto nuclear power, or go to war, unless something changed. And the one thing that could change was to go back to Oman and negotiate again, but this time around, show a bit more creativity. So in March 2013, a second meeting is held in Oman. This time around, the US is not sending 2 unknown mid-level officials, but a full delegation led by the number 2 at the State Department, Deputy Secretary of State Bill Burns, one of the finest diplomats the United States has. And also a full delegation of non-proliferation experts, senior ones. But more importantly, this time around, the American delegation was equipped with an instrument that they had never been allowed to even touch before, which was a carefully crafted statement on how and under what circumstances the United States would be willing to accept enrichment on Iranian soil. This is what the Iranians have been looking for throughout. This was also the strongest bargaining card the United States had, which Obama knew he was going to play, but the idea was to play it at the end of the negotiations. But because the sanctions clock wasn't ticking faster than the nuclear clock, we had to play it at the very beginning. And the hope was that this would actually create a breakthrough. Because on substance, suddenly, the 2 sides had never been this close to each other. But after 40 years of mutual demonization, of deep mistrust between the 2 countries, even moving closer on substance simply was not enough. The Iranians could not go back to Tehran and say, well, the Americans promised they would accept enrichment. They needed it in writing. The Americans could not put it in writing because if they did, it could leak and it could completely collapse the P5+1 negotiations. Mind you, since this was the most valuable negotiating card the West had, the idea was that this would be played in tandem with the Europeans. Instead, now we did this behind the back of the Europeans. So it was critical that this did not be. And also a fear that if it was put in writing, potentially the Iranians would just pocket the concession and not give anything in return. So there was frustration. What do you do when you move closer to substance, but mistrust is standing in the way? Who has the capacity of bridging this mistrust between the US and Iran? Do they have like a common Facebook friend between Obama and Khamenei that can step in? Well, they did. It was one person. It's the Sultan of Oman. And the idea emerged that if the United States cannot put this in writing to the Iranians, perhaps the United States could put this in writing to the Sultan of Oman. And the Sultan would then, in between his chemotherapy, travel to Iran, meet face to face with the supreme leader of Iran, not show him the letter, but convey the contents of the letter to the Iranians. And if the Iranians still said no, it would not be them expressing distrust of the US, they would now be expressing distrust of the Sultan of Oman, a close ally of theirs. The calculation was that the Iranians could not do that. And that's actually how the biggest breakthrough in this negotiation happened. Incidentally, all of this took place before Rouhani was elected. Ahmadinejad was still president. He opposed the process, but nevertheless. Now, I wanted to mention this for a couple of reasons. First of all, to point out that in this era in which we hear so much about Sunni-Shia rivalries, so much about Persian-Arab tensions, all true, we should not forget it was an Arab country that brought the United States and Iran closer together. But also, we should recognize perhaps a more important conclusion, which is that despite the fact that the United States is the most powerful country in the world, even the most powerful country in the world need friends to be able to bridge mistrust and other problems in diplomacy. This is a reminder to us of treating our friends nicely, particularly those very close by to the north, because we might need them at some point, at moments where it actually is a question of war and peace. Now, after this happened, was another 20 months of negotiations, and finally by July 2015, a final deal was struck between all of these different sides. In its simplest form, and I can go into more details during the Q&A, it prevented two disastrous outcomes. The disastrous outcome of Iran having a pathway to a bomb because of all of the restrictions that was put on the program, and the disastrous outcome of the United States ending up in another probably unending war in the Middle East. Before I leave you, I want to say just a few more things. Actually, I'll leave you with one more. Since right now we are in a situation in which some are saying that there is a better deal that we can have if we just go back to sanctions and pursue more pressure, and that ultimately Obama was a really lousy negotiator, this is the worst deal ever, and if we had just done it differently, we could have gotten a better deal. And then you have the Obama administration saying this was the best deal that we could have gotten. My view is that actually there was a better deal. But it wasn't a better deal that was available in 2015. It was a better deal that was available throughout this period in the many missed opportunities that we had. Let me give you two examples. 2003, May of that year, the Iranians sent a comprehensive negotiation proposal to the United States through the Swiss ambassador in Tehran, who had been tasked by the United States to be the official channel of communication between Iran and the United States in the absence of real diplomatic relations. It was a stunning proposal. I saw it because I was working in Congress at the time, and he gave it to my boss, who was seen as the most knowledgeable person on Iran in Congress because he had lived in Iran in the 70s. And wanted to make sure that we did send it over to the White House so they didn't just go through the State Department channel. My boss sent it to called Rove. He called back within 2 hours. And he said he found it intriguing. He wanted to know if it was authentic. We said, well, it came from the Swiss. And we never heard anything more about it. And incidentally, in that proposal, the Iranians offered to open up their nuclear program for full transparency, collaborate with the United States against all terrorist organizations, above all Al-Qaeda. They offered to abide by the Beirut Declaration, the Saudi peace plan, that all of the Arab countries would recognize Israel in return for the Israeli recognition of the Palestinian state. and also to help stabilize Iraq and ensure that it wouldn't be a sectarian war. We never heard back from the White House. But 4 months later, we saw an article in the Financial Times that said that some sort of peace process, peace offer or negotiation offer had been sent by the Iranians to the US through the Swiss, and the Bush administration's response was to give the Iranians no response at all and instead reprimand the Swiss ambassador for having delivered it in the first place. 2005, the last offer the Iranians made before Ahmadinejad became president. At this moment, the Iranians offered to cap their enrichment program at 3,000 centrifuges. The Europeans didn't even bother sending it to the White House, knowing that Bush would reject anything above 0. In one of the meetings at the White House, I don't remember who, someone asked one of the US negotiators, where do you think you'll end up on the centrifuge issue? Do you think we can go back to the proposal the Iranians put on the table in 2005? And the negotiator laughed and said, we would jump on that opportunity if it existed today, but that ship has sailed. We're constantly chasing the deal we could have gotten 2 years ago. A couple of weeks later, I'm in Lausanne. I have a session with the Iranian foreign minister, interviewing him, trying to see what they think, asking the same questions. Where do you think you will end up on enrichment? How many centrifuges? Do you think you'll get a better deal than what you put on the table in 2005? 3,000 centrifuges. And he laughed and he said, 3,000? That was just an opening bid. We were going to settle for 1,000. By the time the interim deal was struck in 2013, the Iranians had 22,000 centrifuges. They had 10,000 kilos of low-enriched uranium, enough for 10 bombs. They had 190 kilos of medium-enriched uranium, which is one step closer to the grade that you need for Ayotte. With the deal, we managed to get them back to 5,000 centrifuges. 97% of their stockpile is shipped out. At no point can they have more than 400 kilos of LEU, which is not enough for a bomb. That's part of the reason why they can't make a bomb as long as this deal survives. But it's interesting. After a decade of sanctions, we got a deal that has the Iranians having somewhere between 2,000 and 4,000 centrifuges more than what we could have gotten in 2005 prior to the sanctions. The reason I think this is important is because when we pursue policies with unrealistic objectives, and our policy is almost exclusively focused on punishment, coercion, and sanctions, we oftentimes actually give the other side the opportunity to advance their negotiating positions. We lose opportunities. And I'm very fearful that what is happening right now with this deal being very close to collapsing, with Trump walking out of it, and us going back thinking that we can get a better deal with more pressure, that we will either end up in a scenario in which the Iranians will have even more leverage than they did before, or even worse, end up in a military confrontation. On that happy note, thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Trita. My name is Tim Horgan. I'm the Executive Director of the World Affairs Council. Thank you all for coming out tonight. I want to take a moment to introduce our moderator and bring her up here. Pam Jordan is a political scientist who teaches in the Law and Politics program here at Southern New Hampshire University. Her courses encompass the theme of peace and conflict in the modern age and U.S. foreign policy, weapons of mass destruction, and the United Nations and global governance. In addition to various articles in academic journals, Pam has published 2 books, one on the legal reform in post-Soviet Russia, and the other on a Soviet spy in interwar France. Her current research project focuses on U.S.-Canadian water diplomacy. In advanced work in academia, Pam has served as the Executive Director of the NGO Committee on Disarmament, a non-governmental organization with ties to the UN. Pretty appropriate for tonight, I think. And as a staff member at the Kennan Institute for Advanced Russian Studies at the Wilson Center in Washington, D.C. So Pam, come on.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you. I'm honored to moderate tonight. And I guess I'll begin by asking a couple of questions, and then I will hand it over to you, asking please to just give very short remarks, if at all, and to ask your questions in a clear, pointed, and a loud enough way that we could all hear, okay? So, yes? Can you hear me?
I have a microphone, so please
Oh,
make
yeah,
the microphone.
Tim has a microphone.
So everyone can hear.
Yes, and I do have a student out in the audience. Emmanuel, where are you? Is Emmanuel here?
He was here.
He was here. Oh, he had to leave. Okay, he probably got nervous because I said, I'd really like you to ask a question. But he's from Nigeria, and he was in my UN and global governance class. So maybe he'll come back in and I'll have a question for you. So I'm not sure how many people will have questions about what you had been discussing and analyzing and talking about your own experiences in negotiating with Iran, or if most people are more interested in what's happening now. But in order to kind of bridge that, could you talk about the extent to which Iran was implementing the agreement since July 2015, so we can judge ourselves how successful the agreement was up until this point in May 8th, 2018. Thank you.
It's a great question. It's also very, very important to understand why this is happening. The entity that is refereeing the deal is the International Atomic Energy Agency in Vienna, Austria, the IAEA. They were tasked with issuing a report every 3 months assessing whether the Iranians have done what they were obligated to do or not. And if not, then they would issue a report stating that, and there would be appropriate actions taken. They have now issued 11 reports. The last report is actually after Trump walked out of the deal. And every report has said that the Iranians have been living up to the agreement. They have been implementing it. There have been some minor issues. At one point, I think they had the LEU count went slightly above what it was supposed to be. The Iranians themselves actually reported out to the IAEA and self-corrected. So we're not in a scenario in which we can say, look, the Iranians are going to live up to it, so we're going to walk out of it. On the contrary, every other country that is party to this deal has been very critical of the U.S. decision to walk out of this. And remember, this is not just a U.S.-Iran deal. This is a multilateral agreement between 7 countries, which on top of that has been adopted by the UN Security Council with a resolution that passed 15-0. The only countries that have welcomed the decision to walk out of it has been Saudi Arabia, UAE, and Israel, who were quite opposed to it from the very beginning. Also, incidentally, 3 countries that have been pushing the United States to take military action against Iran. So, again, we're not in a situation in which we can say, well, look, they weren't living up to it, and as a result, we have to do this. What is somewhat ironic is that the last phases of the negotiations were very tough. And incidentally, I was a part of the negotiations. I was an informal advisor to the Obama administration. Almost all of those hours were spent on creating various things to make sure that if the Iranians violated, this is what the response would be, and all kinds of checks and balances to make sure that the Iranians wouldn't violate the deal. Very little effort was being put into place of what happens if the U.S. decides to walk out of this deal. So I think future negotiations probably will be forced to taking things such as that into account. But back then, it was inconceivable that the U.S. that had been a driving force of this, only 2 years later would be the driving force of killing the deal.
So in the interest of time, because I see that it's a little bit past 7, why don't we open up then to those of you in the audience who might have a question? Yes, please, go ahead, sorry.
George.
So that now that we've had the meeting between our president and the leader of North Korea, and the nuclear threat from North Korea has almost evaporated. What parallels do you see, and what lessons can we learn based upon the Iranian experience?
Let me change that question a little bit, if you don't mind, and ask, what are the lessons we think the Iranians are learning from this? And I am very sad to see, I was just in another city yesterday in Minnesota, and conversation I had with some of the Iranian students there who are studying there, who have a lot of contacts in Iran, their impression was very similar to mine, which is that a lot of people who 4 or 5 years ago were completely opposed to the idea of Iran having a nuclear bomb. I'm talking about people in Iran. Were completely opposed to the idea of Iran having a nuclear weapon. They were supporting the idea of having enrichment, but they were completely against nuclear weapons, are now concluding that it was a mistake for Iran not to build a bomb. Because if you take a look at the difference, the Iranians had enrichment, but they were at closest 8 to 12 weeks from being able to have the material for the bomb. That's not even counting the time it would take for them to build one, test one, and be able to deliver one. The North Koreans, on the other hand, have several bombs. They've tested several types of bombs. They have sent ballistic missiles that demonstrated that they could reach the United States, at least the West Coast, with those bombs. And we went there and we declared everything is fine after one handshake. The conclusion that we are essentially telling them, and the incentive structure we are creating, is to say, we will not take you seriously until you have a nuclear bomb. When you're short of it, we will violate the deal, but if you actually do have it, then we have no choice but to treat you as an equal. That is not the right incentive structure. Because it would be a disaster if more countries believe that the only way they can actually get the US's respect is by having a nuclear weapon. The other things that we also have to keep in mind when we look at it from the American perspective is the agreement, the JCPOA as it's called, is roughly 150 or so pages. It goes through almost every type of a scenario and try to make sure that it is as watertight as possible. And it is not built on a handshake, it is not built on trust, it's built on mistrust. So the inspections regime is the most thorough one that ever has been put in place. Iran is right now still the most inspected country of all of the countries that the IAEA has inspections. And these are not the type of inspections you saw back in the 1990s when, UN workers with white helmets were running around trying to see where Saddam was hiding his nuclear weapons. These are instruments that are inside the nuclear program that are live sending, that are measuring radiation and other things, and live sending it to Vienna. So if the Iranians were to do something really stupid and fishy, even with the absence of anyone being there, the instruments would be able to report that. So that's what this was based on, making sure that it was so watertight that the Iranians would be extremely foolish to think that they could cheat on this. What we have with the North Koreans, of course, we don't have a deal yet, that's why it's quite premature for Trump to say that the threat is gone, is essentially just a handshake, a repetition of previous promises that the North Koreans have given. And I want to emphasize this, I am much happier seeing that the president is going there and conducting diplomacy than him sitting behind his computer tweeting. So I'm all in favor of the diplomacy, but in order to make sure that we don't give diplomacy a bad name, it has to be something that ultimately can work, because if it doesn't work, then we're going to believe that diplomacy failed, whereas in reality it was the approach to diplomacy.
I'm sorry, I saw that you had your hand up. I did shout on Professor.
Thank you for this review. It's extremely valuable and important, and I'm impressed that you were able to do this without a single note. So I really would like you to probe a little bit more the historical depth of the American relationship with Iran, particularly the overthrow of the Mossadegh regime and the support of the Shah, of course, leading up to the extremely important Iranian Revolution of 1979, which shook the entire region. I mean, it was really, it reshaped the region at that time. And I'm wondering what you see of the continuing importance of Iran leading whatever you would conceive of as the remnants of the Islamic Revolution or Islamism today, and where we go with that in terms of its future role in the region. Is it headed for a potential really important regional power comparable to Saudi, certainly having surpassed Egypt at this point?
Thank you so much. It's a great question. The history of the United States and Iran, of course, is one that has many, many sad episodes with a lot of sins committed by both sides vis-a-vis each other. Most Americans probably don't know that in 1953, Iran had embryonic democracy, a parliamentary system. The parliament was elected directly by the people. The parliament then elected the prime minister. That prime minister was Mohammad Mossadegh, who was a nationalist, who was quite incensed by the fact that the Iranians kept less than 10% of the oil revenue that the British were pumping out of Iranian soil. And he wanted to have the Brits give Iran 50% of the value of their own oil, which the Brits thought was an absolutely absurd proposition, and they went to the United States seeking to overthrow Mossadegh, which the US at first rejected. Then the Brits discovered one of America's great weaknesses during the Cold War, which was to say, okay, we don't know if Mossadegh is a communist, but we also don't know that he may not, whether he will become one or not. So as a result, because there is a risk that he might become one, the United States was convinced, and a coup was made by the CIA and MI6, and Mossadegh was overthrown. The Shah became a more dictatorial ruler. After that, reigned another 25 years. And it's at that moment that the United States essentially loses its innocence in Iran. But what most Americans don't know further is that prior to this, the United States actually had an extremely positive image and position in Iran. Not only because its traditional role as an anti-colonialist power, very skeptical of Britain in this regard, but also because several Americans fought very hard inside of Iran in the beginning of that century to help Iran adopt the constitution and move towards democracy. One of them, Howard Baskerville, died fighting alongside Iranians for a constitution. And there's a statue in Iran that a lot of people still go to and pay their respects to. So that's the America that the Iranians knew prior to 1953. After 1953, of course, it changes. You have the revolution, you have the Iranians take 52 American hostages for 444 days, creating a massive trauma in the United States. And since then, of course, it's mostly been negative, a few episodes of opportunities. I thought that after the nuclear deal, the title of the book is Losing an Enemy, not Lost an Enemy. It's a process, and I believe that if we had continued investing in it, we could have caused it to be a lost enemy. On the issue of Islamism and Iran's role, in the beginning, back in the 1980s, it wasn't the United States that talked about regime change in the region, it was the Iranians. They were seeking to export their revolution, export this brand of political Islam, which most countries in the region were absolutely terrified of, and the Iranians actually failed miserably. Not a single country in the region ended up adopting an Islamic revolution similar to that of Iran. They tried in Bahrain, they failed. They tried in Iraq, they failed. Only in Lebanon, because of other circumstances, did they have a degree of success. Today, it is not the Iranians that are exporting that brand of Islamism. They have increasingly become like the Chinese in the sense of still calling themselves communists, but in practice pursuing a rather different approach. Today, the real source of radical Islam, that's not to say that the Iranians are not doing bad things, but when it comes to actual radical Islam, the type of radical Islam that is motivating people to go and fly into the Twin Towers in New York, or to blow themselves up in the streets of Nice or Brussels or in San Bernardino in California, that is coming out of Wahhabi Islam, which unfortunately is coming out of Saudi Arabia, which is a US ally. There is, of course, a Sunni-Shia rivalry, but I would say that the biggest change that is happening in the last 40 years is not the fault line of Sunni-Shia. That fault line is there. But the more important one, and the reason why I'm saying this is because over the course of the last 40 years, we have not seen the Shia population in the Muslim world dramatically go beyond the roughly 15% that they've always been. The real change is in the world of Sunni Islam, in which more and more have started to identify themselves as Salafists, as Wahhabis. That's the big change that is taking place right now. And that's what I think we have not paid enough attention to our own detriment.
Thank you.
Thank you for very interesting.
Thank you for a very interesting presentation. Our policies keep shifting. We started from regime change for many years, back to working with the regime to try to get closer and change it like what we did in Vietnam. Now back again to regime change. But what's the end game? Has the government thought about what should be the end game? The Trump amount. And the second question is that what is the impact of the current situation on the internal dynamic of Iran? Because that can be a very important factor.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. Great question. So on the first issue, what is the end game of the Trump administration? The first question is, does the Trump administration have an end game? And I'm not sure we can conclusively say that they do, or we can speculate. If we were to speculate what that end game may be, I think it has shifted. I think early on, President Trump himself was rather obsessed with just the idea of undoing anything that had Obama's name on it. But there are other individuals in the circle who have been involved in this issue for far, far longer. John Bolton, who is now the National Security Advisor, has been on the record for more than 15 years arguing for military action against Iran. He even published an op-ed in February of this year, before he became National Security Advisor, arguing for a preemptive nuclear strike against North Korea. So I think someone like him, who has been very explicit about regime change, probably is seeking to utilize his position to convince the president to go in this direction. We know, it was reported just today in Politico, that senior national security advisors and National Security Council members of the Trump administration have been talking to people in the think tanks and trying to see, is there a way for the United States to arm ethnic minorities in Iran in order to start some sort of secession and civil war there? If you're sitting in some of the rivals of Iran, Saudi Arabia for instance, I personally do not believe that the Saudis, who clearly do not practice democracy, are particularly infatuated with the idea of seeing regime change in Iran in order for Iran to become a democracy. On the contrary, if Iran were to become a proper democracy, I think it is quite likely that Iran, if it had a government that actually respected the human rights of its people, that actually met their needs and gave them the appropriate tools to be able to live up to their full potential, I think it's a fairly good guess to say Iran would become an even far more powerful country in the region than it is right now. Why would the Saudis want that? That would further shift the balance of power away from Saudi Arabia towards Iran. What would shift it in Saudi's direction, however, is to either have the United States take military action against Iran. Former Secretary of Defense Bob Gates said in a meeting with the French defense minister, which came out through the WikiLeaks, that the Saudis want to fight Iran to the last American. And so, or if you think about what happened during the Iran war back in the 1980s, there's a very interesting interview that then Foreign Minister of Iraq, Tariq Aziz, gave to Washington Post, saying that Iran's goal had now shifted to the dismemberment of Iran, because it would be easier for Iraq to live next to 5 small Irans than 1 big Iran. This goes back to what I said earlier on. This is about the geopolitical balance of power in the region. And regime change in Iran does not do anything particularly good if it leads to a proper democracy from the Saudi perspective. But regime change that leads to either instability, perhaps civil war, perhaps dismemberment, certainly would resolve the problem of balance of power from the Saudi perspective.
Another question? I'm not sure. Do we have until 7:30?
One more.
Or just one? Okay, we'll entertain one more question. Yes, please.
Ines.
Sorry.
I just wanted to ask you, what do you think that could trigger Iran to pull out of the deal at this point?
Excellent question. So right now, we're in a very tense moment. The Europeans are working very, very hard to see if they can come in and replace the United States in the deal. And replace essentially means that the economic benefits the Iranians were promised as a result of the deal would be delivered by the Europeans by them increasing their trade with Iran in order to keep the Iranians inside of the agreement. They're working very hard to do so. The Trump administration is working very hard to make them fail. They have now just recently issued an order saying that all countries have to go down to 0 purchases of Iranian oil by November, otherwise they will be sanctioned by the United States.
Conveniently, the time of the midterms.
Correct. So it remains to be seen whether the Europeans, the Russians, and others can do something to keep it together, because it's not as easy as for the governments wanting it to take place. If it was up to them, they'll do it. But they cannot force their companies to trade with Iran. There has to be proper business opportunities, and most importantly, how will they be protected against US sanctions? None of these companies are going to choose the Iranian market over the American market. So the focus has now shifted to smaller and medium-sized companies, and the question is there enough of those to actually be able to provide something similar to the economic benefits that were promised? So I'm not particularly hopeful. I think what all sides are doing right now, or the other side, they're trying to play for time. I think they're thinking, this is just my speculation, that if they can just wait it out till after the midterms, as you mentioned, they will have a better idea as to whether this posture by this administration will be sustainable. Because if Congress ends up in Democratic hands in November, then the Democrats have the capacity of doing the checks and balances that the system is based on, which has been lacking for the last 2 years. It will also give an indication as to whether Trump will be a one-term president or a two-term president. And that will have an impact on their calculation of, are they willing to resist and push back against pressure for sanctions from the US, or are they going to succumb to this pressure? Right now, a lot is really riding on what happens here in this country in November.
Okay, great. Okay, we can do one more.
If you could pick the one American that you believe today could be successful in negotiating with Iran, who would that American be?
I appreciate that question. But let me say, the problem right now is not negotiating with Iran. That's not where the problem is. We had a deal. The deal was working. If your question was, who would be the best American that I could pick to go and talk to the president and talk him out of doing this, my answer would be, that's a great question, but I don't know.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Trita, for being here tonight. So I wanted to thank all of you for also joining us. I hope that you found the event interesting and insightful. We do have Trita's book on sale on your way out. If you would like to purchase it, we do take cash, credit, or check. And we want to thank you all for coming out. Thank you, Paul, for making time to come and join us here as well. And again, thank you to Trita. Everybody drive safe and have a good night.